Because one of my questions for you is, how long do you think it's going to last? Because my thing is like, because with you, I know that like your relationships are very hot and cold. We are doing the show. That's the call.
So you don't think 5% is like enough for the
5%
the show?
And the highlights was what we agreed to at the beginning. And there's creative differences with her and the crew.
I really sincerely apologize, truly, to the staff.
Hello, I'm Nerdy John. Podcasting. To say it's blown up over the years is an understatement. Look at any recent internet celebrity and they've either hosted a podcast or been on one themselves. So it came as no surprise when Ethan from H3H3 decided to start his own podcast. This was probably the best decision he could have made, considering that he had just gotten out of legal trouble and many of his recent videos on his main channel were getting demonetized. Though since his meeting with the YouTube CEO, little to none of his videos have seemed to get demonetized as of recently. The podcast gained a steady but loyal audience. However, after a feud with Keemstar, the channel's growth halted. The videos were still getting decent views, however, in the online world, stagnation might as well be death. Ethan needed something that would spark interest in the podcast again, and he knew where to look. Ethan looked towards Baited, a podcast hosted by Keemstar, Colossal is Crazy, and Tommy C. The premise was that Keem and Colossal would argue on various YouTube topics and it would get very heated. Ethan knew what he wanted. The problem was who would be the host. You see, Ethan likes to always be right, only admitting when he's wrong when it's absolutely necessary. So doing a podcast with someone who could potentially create points against him and prove him wrong wasn't a good call. However, he needed someone who would disagree with him. This is where Trisha Paytas comes in. Trisha is kind of like a Kardashian. She's famous for being famous. Other than YouTube, her claim to fame is being on various reality TV shows and being in an Eminem music video from a less than critically successful album. Ethan had done a video calling out fake Instagram models, and Trisha was included in the video. After some back and forth on Twitter, she appeared on an episode of the H3H3 podcast, and the banter she and Ethan had interested the viewers. Not only that, but she was located in the LA area, so Ethan wouldn't have to fly her out or do the podcast via Discord. And so, the Frenemies podcast was born. Frenemies brought new life to the H3H3 podcast channel, bringing over Trisha's audience as well as sponsors. Plus, Ethan being in the commentary community and Trisha essentially being a T channel, drama would be a forward topic. However, it wouldn't always be the main topic. Most of the time, the topic would be about Trisha and Ethan's weight or their extravagant lives. Sometimes the episodes would have one-off themes, like a quiz show, to keep viewers interested. However, when they would talk about drama, it would often be very vicious. Targets like David Dobrik, Gabby Hanna, and James Charles were people that, well, got into a bit of controversy, but more importantly, they got into controversy with Ethan and Trisha. You see, they don't really care about something unless it directly affects them. For example, you couldn't get Ethan to shut up about the James Charles situation. However, he only gave EDP a passing mention, even though what he did was arguably way worse. This is because James had a competing clothing line with Gila's Teddy Fresh designs. This was a good setup for them. They would often work with journalists who would do hit pieces on these creators, and YouTube channels that were still loyal to Ethan and Trisha would make videos on this as well. However, having such a toxic method of attack will eventually bite you in the end. It should be noted before going forward that Trisha has since apologized for what has happened. Whether or not you find the apology sincere, I'll leave it up to you. On the last episode of the podcast, it seemed to be a normal episode. There was even a skit relating to their costumes. However, under the surface, it was clear that Trisha was deeply disturbed during filming. In the last few minutes of the show, they began to argue over money. Lovely. You see, Trisha gets a 45% cut of the episode's earnings, while Ethan gets a 55% cut, although 5% of that goes to the show and staff. After accusing each other of gaslighting, Trisha stormed out. You see, it wasn't a question of if the podcast would fail, but when the podcast would fail. Ethan was fully exploiting Trisha's mental instability for views. However, Trisha wasn't innocent during this either, often saying things that would purposefully get Ethan angry. Ethan is a narcissist, and Trisha will cry when someone jokingly calls her fat. It was only a matter of time before things blew up. The aftermath of the show was interesting as well. If we go by likes to dislikes, Ethan won this little spat. However, his podcast will suffer in the long term. At the time of this recording, he has started a new podcast with his mother. While I'm sure more dedicated fans will enjoy it, I'm not sure if it will be good for long-term growth. Trisha will continue doing what she does best, rambling for nearly an hour while still having an audience. The downfall of this podcast was one for the ages, and since Joe Rogan has left YouTube for Spotify, Ethan was kinda the most important podcast host on the platform. And since the disappearance of the Frenemies podcast, someone will need to fill that void soon. This is Nerdy John. I hope you enjoyed the video.